I was standing in the kitchen, the phone pressed against my ear, disbelief washing over me in cold waves. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Harper, your mother passed away." The voice on the other end, a doctor from Chicago General Hospital, sounded distant, like a faint echo in a long, empty hallway. "My mother?" I murmured, my voice barely a whisper. The room spun, and I gripped the countertop for support. Last week, we had talked about her coming over for Thanksgiving. She was fine then. How could this be? I had to tell Martin. He had been working in Europe for the past 3 months, and communication had been sparse, but he needed to know. I dialed his number, my hands trembling. After several rings, he answered. "Martin, it's Elaine. My mom, she passed away." There was a pause, and then his voice, devoid of warmth, came through. "Oh, I see. Look, Elaine, I'm really tied up right now. I've got a trip planned with the guys to Barcelona. Can't really skip it." His words hit me like a physical blow. "You're not coming back? Not even for the funeral?" I struggled to keep my voice steady. "Elaine, you know how it is with my job. I'll be back in a couple of months. Just handle things there, okay?" And without waiting for my response, he hung up. I stood there, the phone still in my hand, feeling a hollow emptiness growing inside me. My mother was gone, and the man I had spent 20 years with couldn't care less. The next few days passed in a blur of arrangements and condolences, a relentless march of reality that I navigated like a ghost. It was on the 3rd day, in the midst of this, that I received another call that seemed to stop time altogether. It was Martin's brother, Alex. "Elaine, there's been an accident. Mom and Dad, they're gone." The phone slipped from my grasp and clattered to the floor. Martin's parents, too? It felt like some cruel joke, a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I called Martin, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I left message after message, each one more desperate than the last. I couldn't go to his parents' funeral. Without Martin, I was just an outsider, a reminder of the son who couldn't be bothered to show up. The thought of their empty seats, an unspoken accusation in the air, was unbearable. As the days passed, I found myself sitting alone in the house we had built together, surrounded by memories that now seemed like lies. I thought back to how we met, introduced by our fathers, who were old college friends. It had felt like a fairy tale then, our families joining together in a bond of love and friendship. But as the years went by, the fairy tale had slowly faded. Martin was always busy, always absent. His work was his life, and I, along with our son Peter, were just fixtures in his world. When Peter was 10, my father passed away. My rock, my confidant, gone. Martin had been away on a business trip then, too. I was left alone to deal with the grief, to support our son, to keep the family together. And now, with both our families shattered, I was alone again. Our marriage had become a routine of loneliness and resentment. I was the homemaker, the silent supporter, while Martin was the absent provider. But was he really providing, or just running away from a life he no longer wanted? I tried to remember the last time we had laughed together or shared a moment of genuine connection. But all I could see was the growing distance between us, a chasm filled with unspoken words and unmet needs. As I sat there, lost in my thoughts, I realized that this wasn't just about his absence. It was about the lack of respect, the lack of empathy. It was about a marriage that had become a hollow shell of what it once was. And as the sun set, casting long shadows across the room, I knew that something had to change. I couldn't live in this shadow any longer. The days following the funerals were a whirlwind of silent houses and unanswered calls. I tried to reach Martin again, but it was as if he had vanished off the face of the earth. That's when the memories began to creep in, unwelcome and unbidden. I remembered our early days, how Martin's charm and ambition had swept me off my feet. We were young, in love, and the world seemed full of possibilities. But as years passed, the man I fell in love with started to fade, replaced by someone consumed by work and his own needs. I was pulled from my reverie by a knock on the door. Standing there was Alex, Martin's younger brother. His eyes were red-rimmed, his usual cheerful demeanor nowhere in sight. "Elaine, I can't believe he didn't show up. Not even a call," he said, his voice heavy with grief and disbelief. "I know, Alex. I've been trying to reach him, but..." Nothing. Alex shook his head, his anger palpable. "You know, Elaine, there's something deeply wrong with him. Mom and Dad deserved better. You deserve better." His words struck a chord in me. deserve better. The thought had crossed my mind, but hearing it from someone else made it real. It wasn't just me feeling this way. Elaine, if you need anything, just let me know, okay? Alex offered before he left, a hint of worry in his eyes. That night, as I lay in bed, the house eerily quiet, I realized how much of my life I had dedicated to a man who saw me as nothing more than a convenience. The love, the support, the sacrifices, it was as if they meant nothing to him. A mixture of anger and resolve began to build within me. I wasn't going to be the silent, suffering wife anymore. I needed to find out what Martin was up to, what was so important that he couldn't even show up for his own parents' funeral. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I hired a private investigator. It was a drastic step, but I needed to know the truth. The PI was a middle-aged woman named Sarah who had a no-nonsense air about her. "We'll find out what he's up to," Sarah assured me. "It won't take long." True to her word, within a week, Sarah came back with information that shattered any illusions I had left about Martin. Photos and reports of him with another woman in Barcelona, looking carefree and in love. As I looked at the photos, a cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. This wasn't just a business trip. This was a betrayal of everything our marriage was supposed to stand for. I confronted Martin over the phone. His response was a cocktail of excuses and deflections. "Elaine, you're blowing this out of proportion. It's just a work thing." "A work thing? Is that what you call this?" I countered, my voice shaking with anger. "You wouldn't understand. It's complicated," he snapped back, his voice cold and distant. I realized then that I was speaking to a stranger. The man I had married, the man I had built a life with, was gone. In his place was someone who saw me as nothing more than a hurdle to his desires. That night, as I lay awake, the weight of my decision heavy on my chest, I knew there was no going back. Martin had made his choice, and now it was time for me to make mine. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. I would no longer be a prisoner in my own life. The days after discovering Martin's betrayal were a blur of anger and disillusionment. Each morning, I awoke to the stark reality of my solitary struggle. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now echoed with the silence of betrayal. I busied myself with the mundane tasks of daily life, but my mind was elsewhere, consumed with thoughts of Martin's deceit. The images from the investigator's report haunted me, a constant reminder of his infidelity. One evening, as I was going through old photo albums, a picture of our wedding day caught my eye. We looked so happy, so in love. I couldn't help but wonder where it had all gone wrong. Was it gradual, or had there been a specific moment when Martin decided I was no longer enough for him? My train of thought was interrupted by a call from Peter, our son. "Hey, Mom, how are you holding up?" "I'm managing, Peter," I replied, trying to sound stronger than I felt. There was a pause before he spoke again, his voice laced with concern. "Mom, I've been thinking. Maybe I should come home for a while, help you through this." His offer touched me deeply, but I couldn't let him put his life on hold for me. "No, Peter, you need to focus on your studies. I'll be fine." But Peter was insistent. "Mom, this isn't just about you. Dad's actions affect me too. I need to be there for you." His determination was a balm to my wounded heart. Despite Martin's absence, Peter had grown into a caring and responsible young man. His support gave me strength, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel so alone. A few days later, Peter arrived. His presence filled the house with a much-needed energy. We spent hours talking, sharing our thoughts and feelings about Martin and the situation at hand. "It's just so selfish, Mom. How could Dad do this to us?" Peter's anger mirrored my own. "I don't know, Peter, but I do know that we can't let his actions destroy us. We're stronger than that." As we talked, a plan began to form in my mind. Martin had taken so much from us, it was time he understood the consequences of his actions. I wasn't going to be the silent victim anymore. It was time for Martin to face the music. The following week, I met with a lawyer to discuss the possibility of divorce. The lawyer, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Hammond, listened intently as I recounted the events of the past few weeks. "Mrs. Harper, based on what you've told me, you have a strong case for divorce, especially with the evidence of infidelity," she said, her tone professional yet empathetic. I nodded, a mix of relief and apprehension washing over me. This was really happening. I was taking the first step towards freeing myself from Martin's shadow. As I left Mrs. Hammond's office, a newfound sense of purpose filled me. I was no longer the woman who waited silently for her husband to return. I was Elaine Harper, and I was going to take control of my life. But as I stood there looking out at the bustling city streets, a part of me couldn't help but mourn the loss of the life I thought I had. The happy family, the loving husband, it was all an illusion, shattered by the harsh light of reality. As I headed home, I knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Martin had underestimated me for the last time. The revelation of Martin's affair had set a fire within me, one that burned with the need for justice and retribution. As I sat in our living room, the walls seemed to close in on me, each family portrait a reminder of the facade our life had become. My resolve was tested one evening when Martin called. His voice, once familiar and comforting, now grated on my nerves. "Elaine, I've been thinking. Maybe I was too harsh. We should talk when I get back." His words, meant to soothe, only fueled my anger. "Talk? After everything you've done? You abandoned your family, Martin." "Elaine, you're overreacting. It's not like I planned this. Things just happened," he replied, his tone dismissive, as if his betrayal was a mere inconvenience. "Things just happened? You make it sound like you had no choice in the matter. You chose to be with another woman. You chose to ignore your own parents' funeral." There was silence on the other end, and for a moment, I thought he had hung up. Then he spoke, his voice cold. "I don't have time for this, Elaine. I have important work here." That was the last straw. "Important work? Is that what you call abandoning your family? You know what, Martin? Maybe it's time I made some important decisions of my own." I hung up before he could respond. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. It was time for action. The next day, I met with Sarah, the private investigator. "We need more evidence, anything that can help in the divorce proceedings," I told her, my voice firm. Sarah nodded, understanding the assignment. "I'll see what I can dig up. Martin won't know what hit him." Over the next few weeks, Sarah provided me with a steady stream of evidence. Photos, emails, and even testimonies from people who had seen Martin with his mistress. It was more than enough to paint a clear picture of his infidelity. Armed with this information, I met with Mrs. Hammond again. She reviewed the evidence, her expression grim. "This will certainly help your case, Mrs. Harper. It seems Mr. Harper has been quite careless." As we discussed the next steps, a plan began to take shape. Martin had always been proud of his reputation, both personally and professionally. It was time to use that against him. "Mrs. Hammond, I want to make sure Martin feels the consequences of his actions, not just legally, but personally and professionally as well." Mrs. Hammond regarded me with a new level of respect. "I understand, Mrs. Harper. We'll make sure he gets what he deserves." When Martin finally returned home, it was to a cold and unwelcoming house. I greeted him with divorce papers, my expression as hard as the resolve within me. "Elaine, what is this?" he asked, his voice a mix of surprise and annoyance. "It's over, Martin. I'm filing for divorce, and before you try to talk your way out of this, know that I have enough evidence to ruin you." Martin's face turned a shade paler, his usual confident demeanor crumbling. "You wouldn't dare," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I dare, Martin. I dare to stand up for myself and for our son. You've made your choices, and now you'll live with the consequences." As he read through the papers, his face twisted in anger and disbelief. But there was no going back. I had drawn the line, and there was no crossing it. That night, as Martin packed his bags and left, I felt a sense of liberation. The chains of our loveless marriage were finally broken. I was free to start anew, free from the lies and deceit that had bound me for so long. As I watched him drive away, a sense of justice filled me. This was just the beginning. Martin would soon learn that his actions had consequences that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The days following Martin's departure were filled with a tumultuous mix of emotions. Anger, relief, and a sense of vindication swirled within me. The house, now void of his presence, felt larger, as if it too had been holding its breath under his oppressive shadow. My resolve was tested when I received a call from Martin, his tone a mix of anger and desperation. "Elaine, you're ruining me." The divorce papers, the allegations. Do you realize what you're doing? His words were like fuel to my fire. Yes, Martin, I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm showing the world who you really are. You can't do this to me. I've worked hard for everything I have, he argued, his voice laced with entitlement. Worked hard? You mean you've lied and cheated your way through our marriage? You've made your bed, Martin. Now you have to lie in it. Martin's voice rose, a crescendo of frustration and disbelief. You were nothing before me. You think you can just take everything? I felt a surge of power at his words. I was nothing? No, Martin. I was everything you didn't appreciate. And now I'm taking back what's mine. The call ended with Martin's threats echoing in my ears, but they no longer held any power over me. I was done being the victim. As the divorce proceedings began, Martin's true nature became evident for all to see. His attempts to hide assets and slander me only served to damage his reputation further. The evidence Sarah had gathered painted a clear picture of his deceit and infidelity. The court hearings were tense, with Martin's lawyers trying every trick in the book. But Mrs. Hammond was a force to be reckoned with, countering their moves with precision and finesse. Throughout it all, Peter stood by my side, his support unwavering. He had grown disillusioned with his father, the truth eroding any semblance of respect he once held. The day the divorce was finalized was a day of liberation. As the judge declared our marriage dissolved, a weight lifted from my shoulders. I had won, not just the divorce, but my freedom from Martin's shadow. After the court session, Martin approached me, a shell of the man he once was. Elaine, please, we can still fix this. I looked at him, really looked at him, and what I saw was a man broken by his own arrogance. There's nothing left to fix, Martin. You broke everything worth saving. Walking away from him, I felt a chapter of my life closing. The pain, the betrayal, the lies, they were all behind me now. Ahead lay a path of my own making, free from the deceit that had clouded my life for so long. As I stepped out of the courthouse, the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the world in a warm golden light. It felt like a sign, a promise of new beginnings and brighter days ahead. I turned to Peter, a smile spreading across my face. Let's go home, son. We have a new life to start. And with that, we walked away, leaving Martin and the past where they belonged, behind us. With the divorce finalized, I was determined to reveal the extent of Martin's disgrace to those who had been blinded by his facade. I knew that true justice wouldn't come from the courts alone. It had to come from exposing him to the world. I started by reaching out to our mutual friends, people who had known us as a couple for years. The initial reactions were mixed, with some refusing to believe the truth, but I had evidence, undeniable proof of his infidelity and deceit. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. One evening, I invited a few friends over, people who had doubted me initially. As they sat in my living room, I showed them the messages and pictures Sarah had gathered. Shock and disbelief filled the room as they saw Martin's true colors laid bare. One friend, Lisa, shook her head in disbelief. I can't believe I defended him all this time. He's a monster. Tears welled up in my eyes as I nodded. He fooled us all, but now you know. Lisa was the first to take action. She contacted others in our social circle, sharing the evidence and urging them to reconsider their alliances. Soon, the once seemingly impenetrable wall of support around Martin began to crumble. One by one, our friends distanced themselves from him, appalled by his actions. The same people who had once admired him now saw him for what he was, a selfish, deceitful man who had no regard for anyone but himself. As Martin's social standing crumbled, he became increasingly isolated. His attempts to salvage his reputation only made things worse, as he lashed out at those who had abandoned him. His once strong network of contacts began to disappear, leaving him with no one to turn to. I watched with a sense of grim satisfaction as the man who had caused me so much pain faced the consequences of his actions. It wasn't enough for him to lose his friends. I wanted him to lose everything. One day, I received a call from Martin's former boss, Mr. Reynolds. He had heard about the divorce and the scandal surrounding Martin. Elaine, I had no idea. I can't believe he would do such things. I sighed, my voice heavy with exhaustion. It's been a long time coming, Mr. Reynolds. Martin's true nature finally caught up with him. Mr. Reynolds paused, then spoke with a hint of regret. I'm sorry to hear about all of this, but I wanted to let you know that Martin's behavior at the company has also come to light. We've decided to terminate his employment. I felt a rush of vindication. Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. It's about time he faced the consequences. As the news of Martin's termination spread, his world crumbled further. He had lost his job, his friends, and his reputation. It was a fall from grace that he couldn't recover from. But I wasn't done yet. I had one final move to make, one that would ensure Martin paid for his actions in the most significant way possible. With Martin's world in shambles, it was time for the final blow, the ultimate revenge that would ensure he paid for his sins. I had discovered a hidden secret during the divorce proceedings, one that would bring him to his knees. Late one evening, as I sat in my quiet home, I made the call I had been dreading but also eagerly anticipating. The voice on the other end was familiar, cold, and detached. "Martin, we need to talk." There was a long pause before he replied, his voice wary. "What do you want, Elaine?" "I want justice, Martin. I want you to pay for everything you've done." My words were deliberate, each one carrying the weight of my anger and determination. Martin chuckled, a mocking sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You think you can do anything to me now? I've lost it all, Elaine. What more could you possibly take from me?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I know about your hidden accounts, Martin, the offshore ones you thought were safe. I have the evidence, and I'm not afraid to expose you." Silence hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I could hear the panic in his voice when he finally responded. "How did you?" "That's not important right now," I interrupted. "What matters is that I have the power to ruin you completely. The authorities will be very interested in those accounts, Martin." His voice trembled as he spoke, desperation creeping in. "What do you want, Elaine? Money? Is that what this is about?" I couldn't help but laugh. A bitter and vindictive sound. "Money won't fix the damage you've done, Martin. But it will ensure you suffer for a long time." I outlined my terms, a substantial portion of his hidden wealth to be transferred to me as compensation for the years of pain and betrayal. Martin had no choice but to agree, his voice defeated. As I hung up the phone, I felt a rush of satisfaction. Martin had lost everything, his job, his reputation, and now his secret wealth. He was a broken man, a shadow of his former self. But I had won. I had taken back control of my life, exposed him for the monster he was, and ensured that he would pay for his actions. It was a sweet victory, one that had been a long time coming. In the end, it wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my own dignity and self-worth. I had emerged from the darkness stronger and more resilient than ever. As I sat alone in my quiet home, I couldn't help but smile. The nightmare was finally over, and I was free to live my life on my terms. Martin's downfall was a satisfying end to a chapter of my life that I was more than ready to leave behind.